inviting me to join you this morning. I was fortunate enough to be able to drop in on a few of your earlier sessions, and it's such a thrilling program. I'm so impressed, and I'm really looking forward to our discussions this morning. So as Fatima said, my name is Jenny Cresswell. I am the technical lead for measurement and monitoring in Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research in WHO in Geneva. So I have a global focus, but one of my responsibilities is what we call ICDMM, which is what obviously we're going to be talking about this morning, as well as the other chapters of ICD which are relevant to sexual and reproductive health. And it's also my team who produce the UN estimates of maternal mortality, the global mortality estimates, which are published every few years. So an added benefit for me with my selfish hat on of us having this discussion today is important, like the estimates that we can produce are only as good as the data and what is recorded on the form. So us all being clear about how we apply the principles of ICDMM, how we record and classify causes of death, not only helps you all make improvements within your own facilities and your own countries and your own settings, it also has a broader use, because the better data we have as inputs into the MMR estimates, the better and the more accurate our estimates will be. And ultimately, that's how we'll all move forward. So I'm really thrilled to be with you today. So the objectives of what we're going to cover in this session, by the end of the session, I really hope that all of you on this call are going to be able to both understand and be able to explain to others the distinction between pregnancy-related deaths and maternal deaths. Probably most of you are already aware of that, but we will go over that as a bit of a refresher to start off with. And if anyone is less sure, please do ask questions and we can all help each other. We're then going to do a deep dive into what ICDMM is and talk a bit more about the main groups of the causes of maternal death, which are in ICDMM. And then finally, we're going to do some practice with some examples about how to apply ICDMM to specific scenarios, specific vignettes, and discuss how we assign the cause of maternal death. So this session is building upon a lot of what I know has been covered already in this great series. And I know you last week or the week before, you had a session from Hilary and Benson focusing on the international classification of diseases more broadly and medical certification of cause of death. And the important things that we're going to be building on today, and we'll do a brief recap before we go forward to make sure that everyone remembers, and if anyone wasn't on the previous call, that they understand, is the distinction between what we call the underlying cause of death and any contributing factors, and the basic principles of how you fill out the international medical certificate for cause of death. In this session, we're looking very specifically at maternal death, and we'll talk also a bit more about some of the special issues that arise specifically in our area. I know the presentation that Hilary and Benson previously gave was much broader because they were discussing all causes of death for anyone from any cause. So in this session, it's the same principles because ICDMM is obviously part of ICD. But we're
Jen,
yep.
Sorry, Jen. Sorry to disturb you. One of our colleague is saying that your voice is like it sounds a bit distant.
Okay. Is this better?
Sirak, is this better? Sirak?
Yes.
Is it better?
Let's see. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, great. If you can't hear me or you need me to speak up or slow down, please do let me know. With my screen shared, I can't see the chat box as well. So if there's anything like that, please do.
I'll let you know.
I can see that there's 9 new comments, but I have no idea what they are. Yes, so as I'm saying, we're going to be looking very specifically at maternal death and talking about some of the maybe slightly trickier areas that arise in this area. So just to make sure we're all on the same page before we go forward, can we start by, can someone volunteer to raise your hand or speak out and tell me what is ICD? We have a brave volunteer.
International Classification of Disease.
Yep, exactly. And more than that, what is it? So that's its title, that's its name. What's it for? What do we use it for?
Hi, this is Beatrix. May I?
Please go ahead, yes.
It's a standard way of listing diseases so that from country to country or from region to region or hospital to hospital, we are all talking about the same thing.
Absolutely perfect. That was a wonderful answer. Thank you, Beatrice. Couldn't have said it better myself. So yeah, as both speakers have just said, ICD is an acronym that we use, International Classification of Diseases, and it's a tool. It's a way of systematically recording both diseases, but not just diseases, as there's many other health outcomes and contexts with the health system within ICD, for example, family planning and so on. All also has ICD codes as well, and it's not a disease. So it's diseases and health conditions. And exactly as my colleague just said, the reason we want to use this is so that we all know that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking across time or across different settings, so that we can make accurate comparisons and we all know that we're talking about the same thing. Perfect. So then what is the underlying cause of death? It's distinct from the contributing causes of death. Can anyone remember the distinction between these two concepts?
You can say the cause of death.
The cause of death? I suppose you could, yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good answer. So the underlying death, it's the first, it's the event which initiated the chain of events which were leading to the death. So on the death certificate, which we will have a look at again, which I know you looked at many times in the previous session by Benson and Hillary, and we will also be looking at more today. It's the bottom line of part 1 of the death certificate. So you'll recall that the chain of events, the conditions which led to the death are recorded chronologically on the form, and the underlying cause is the whatever disease or condition initiated that chain. So it goes on the bottom. For our purposes today, there's something else really important we need to remember, and that's that you can only ever have one underlying cause of death. And because ICDMM is specifically looking at the underlying causes of death, it's our way of classifying a single cause for maternal mortality. So as we all know, when we see women in our day-to-day lives and so on, it's in reality often many things go wrong at the same time. It's not necessarily always as simple as saying that one person died of one single thing and nothing else happened to her. But because this is a classification system and our aim is to be making comparisons and our aim is to report statistics and data in a standardized way so that we can take actions and prioritize and focus our resources in the best way possible to deal with the problem at hand, there's a trade-off and we make this slight simplification to enable us to present our data clearly and give clear messages. The second concept is the contributory causes of death, or the contributory conditions. And there can be many of these. And these can be used to reflect the fact, as I was just saying, that the reality of a woman's death may be complex and there are many different things going on. So that gets recorded in part 2 of the death certificate. So ICDMM is focusing very much on the former, and today this is very much what we're going to be focusing on. It's the underlying cause of death, although contributory conditions are obviously still very important. And this is just a quick reminder of the important part of what the International Certificate of Cause of Death looks like as relates to what we're talking about today. So you can see on my screen, I hope, we've got part 1 for the underlying cause and part 2 down below. And as you can see, the events that happened are recorded chronologically, and the approximate time interval is recorded to the right of the event. And the reason for doing that is to help you so that you can correctly assign the order and therefore come to a correct decision about what the underlying cause of death would be. And who on this slide here, who can tell me what the underlying cause of death is? Anyone? So
it's uterine atony.
It is wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing. And how do you know that?
Because that's the event that triggered the whole sequence of events. So at delivery, after delivery, they had uterine atony, which led to postpartum hemorrhage. And because maybe it was managed late, they ended up having hypovolemic shock, and they died from the hypovolemic shock.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So that's one of the things we're looking at a lot today, and will be throughout the rest of the session. The other really, really important thing as relates to maternal death and ICDMM is what we call a pregnancy checkbox. And you can see that at the bottom of the slide. So it's recommended, although obviously countries vary somewhat in the format and how they fill them out, but it's recommended that all death certificates include a box for marking whether the woman had been pregnant at the time of her death, or if she was not pregnant but had been pregnant within the last 42 days, or if she'd been pregnant within the last year. And the reason we do that is because if that doesn't happen, we know from studies, from validation studies and other work, there's an awful lot of maternal deaths get missed. So this pregnancy checks box, it's really quite important. It was actually approved by the World Health Assembly in 1990 to include it on all the death certificates. So that World Health Assembly, for anyone who's not aware, is a bit like a parliament of every single country, every single member state in the world meets in Geneva every May. And every May when there's not a pandemic going on. And they take decisions about all the important policy decisions affecting the world. So the World Health Assembly approved and mandated this change, which shows how important it is. And it's there to act as a reminder for the certifier to record the woman's pregnant status. And it's absolutely essential in your facilities and in your places of work that it's really important to make sure that this box is completed. It's important for all maternal deaths to make sure we capture them correctly and accurately. And as we will discuss later, it's particularly important with a type of maternal death called indirect maternal death. Because if the pregnancy status is not correctly filled in on the death certificate, these are particularly vulnerable to be getting lost, because these are deaths where women die from the complication of another illness in her pregnancy. So if the pregnancy status is not recorded, then that information can be lost completely. Whereas with things like hemorrhage and postpartum sepsis and so on, obviously it's still important, but at least we can tell from the underlying cause of death that there was a delivery involved. So, as I was saying, today we're going to be talking about ICDMM. And I'm sure it's pretty obvious to everyone, but just in case not, the MM stands for maternal mortality. So ICDMM is the application of ICD to maternal death. So important thing to note is it's not saying anything different or new to what Hilary and Benson and other colleagues have already talked about. ICDMM is very much part of ICD, but it's a special application. So because maternal deaths are quite complicated, and historically people have found it quite difficult to apply some of the principles on ICD and to be consistent, partly as because of some of the factors that make maternal death special. We have this kind of special guide which pulls it all together in one place and helps people apply consistent coding rules. But fundamentally, everything that is here is also recorded on the websites and the huge dictionaries of codes that I know that Hilary and Benson have previously shown you. So there's nothing new here. It's meant to be an aid to help you do your work and help you bring everything together in one place. So within ICD, death with a causal or a temporal relationship to pregnancy can be any one of the following, and we will discuss these more on the next slide. So they can be maternal death, they can be pregnancy-related death, and they can be late maternal death. So we'll go through what those are on the next slide. And yeah, as I've already said, it's intended to facilitate the collection, analysis, interpretation of information on maternal death, exactly the same as ICD, but specific to maternal. At the moment, the publication, and there's a screenshot of it on the right, and you can find it online on our website. I have the link on the final slide, is still for ICD-10, because that's what we've been using since this was done in 2012, and at the moment that's what countries are still using. In the next year or two, we will do an update to produce a new version for ICD-11. But in general, there's not many changes as regards maternal between ICD-10 and 11. Not many big changes anyway. There's a few, there's some small changes, but the big concepts are staying the same. So what we're talking about today will still be valid when ICD-11 comes in, but we'll do a nice new version so that it's not confusing and everything's all updated and so on. So, okay, so a maternal death. So what is a maternal death? WHO defines a maternal death as the death of a woman whilst pregnant or within 42 days of the termination of pregnancy, irrespective of the duration and site of the pregnancy, from any cause related to or aggravated by the pregnancy or by its management, but not from accidental or incidental causes. So what does this mean? It means that for maternal death, we don't mind what the outcome for the fetus was. So whether it's a live birth, a stillbirth, an induced abortion, and spontaneous abortion, all of these are still maternal death. And it's a death which either occurred during the pregnancy or within 42 days. So that corresponds to the kind of traditional 6-week postpartum period from the end of the pregnancy or from the abortion if it was an abortion. It's irrespective of the duration and site. So for example, if it's an ectopic pregnancy, it's still a maternal death. But what is important, that the pregnancy in some way, the fact that the woman was pregnant, caused that death. And this is what we mean by when we say, but not from accidental or incidental causes. So for example, if a woman is pregnant and she is out in the town and she is hit by a car in a traffic accident, she dies at the scene, she dies immediately from her injuries, that's an accidental death. It's not related to the pregnancy. So that's not a maternal death. But any death where the death arose because in some way of the fact that she had been pregnant, either was pregnant or had been pregnant, is a maternal death. And we divide maternal deaths into two groups, and we call these direct obstetric deaths and indirect obstetric deaths. So what are these? Direct obstetric deaths are those resulting from obstetric complications of pregnancy. And just as a kind of general terminology note, within ICD, quite often when we say pregnancy, we mean the pregnant state. So we include the labor and the postpartum period as well, which isn't, it can sometimes cause a bit of confusion, I know, because it's not the way that the layman necessarily refers to being pregnant when they mean when the fetus or embryo is inside the woman. So a direct obstetric deaths are those resulting from the obstetric complications of pregnancy. And this can be from interventions or omissions or incorrect treatment, anything to do with that, and from a chain of events resulting from these. Whereas indirect obstetric deaths are those which result from either a previous existing disease, or it could be a disease that developed during the pregnancy itself, which is not due to direct obstetric causes, but it was aggravated in some way by the pregnancy. And we'll talk more about this later, but this could be examples where the woman has, for example, diabetes or an infectious disease, where she already had the disease or the disease arose during pregnancy. But the fact that she was pregnant, for example, we know that during pregnancy, our immune responses are somewhat different. You can get more sick from certain respiratory diseases and many other diseases. So the fact that she was pregnant meant that she died when in a kind of alternative parallel universe where she'd not been pregnant, she might have survived. So we take these as indirect obstetric death. And as I remarked earlier, the pregnancy checkbox is particularly important for indirect obstetric death. It's very important for all, but it's particularly important for these indirect obstetric deaths because the direct obstetric deaths are nearly all coded in ICD with an O code. So O20, O70, O53 or whatever. Whereas indirect obstetric death, the code can relate to whatever that other disease is. So diabetes, for example. And they get given a secondary O code, but it is a secondary code. So if you don't use this pregnancy tick box, it's very easy for the pregnancy status to get lost when the data is aggregated up in the statistics offices and the ministries of health and so on. So that's why this pregnancy checkbox is so important. I mentioned that there was this other concept, that of a pregnancy-related death. And pregnancy-related death is all deaths of women during or within 42 days of pregnancy, regardless of cause. So, for example, the woman I mentioned who was hit by a car, and I said that that was not a maternal death because it was an accidental death. It was still a pregnancy-related death. So the only thing that matters to define a pregnancy-related death is timing and pregnancy status. There's no causality. The underlying cause of death doesn't have to be related to the pregnancy, although it can be. So maternal deaths are also pregnancy-related deaths. They fall into both buckets. Pregnancy-related death is a broader term which captures both maternal death, but also these additional accidental deaths. And pregnancy-related death it's similar in principle to, you'll all be aware of things like infant mortality, when we're not so worried about what the infant died of, just the fact that the infant was in the first year of life, for example. So that's kind of the analogous concept. Whereas maternal death is special because there's an aspect of causality involved. And that's why ICDMM is so important, and consistent recording of the cause of death is so important. The final definition I wanted to make sure everyone was well aware of is a late maternal death. So a late maternal death, it's the same definition as the earlier maternal death on the slide, on 2 slides ago, but the timing is different. So it's deaths that occur after 42 days, but within 1 year of the end of pregnancy. And this is something which, so it exists in ICD-10, it already exists, but it's something which we are going to try and be promoting much more in future years as more and more countries adopt ICD-11, because there's more and more evidence that actually quite a lot of women die after the first 6 weeks, so after 42 days from the end of the pregnancy, from things which we think are still related to her pregnancy, but they weren't captured by the traditional definition. So it's not a new change, and we're not changing the definition of maternal death. That's still remains the traditional 42 days, but we're adding this extra concept where people can record these late maternal deaths as well, because they are important and they probably require different interventions to avert compared to the more traditional maternal death, which is often a complication which takes place on the day of delivery. Whereas late maternal deaths are often due to causes, there are more indirect causes, for example, and the interventions in terms of follow-up and postpartum care are quite different. So it's an addition rather than a change, but something to be aware of. So this was just a diagram I made just to show how things fit together. So death during pregnancy, childbirth, and puerperium is your broad concept of pregnancy-related death. And within that, you have both maternal death and death due to coincidental causes. So that's just a diagram to show you how it all fits together.